The power! The power! Before I got a big bike, every single time I would talk to other bikers about big bikes, their major selling point was nearly always the power. But for me, it's not just about the power. Yes, there is a significant difference in power between a 125 and a big bike. But back when I rode a 125, I did get an opportunity to ride a couple of big bikes briefly, a CBR 600 and a Suzuki Bandit, and then a few months later I was out on my DAS training and test on an MT-07, and then a few months after that I got my Daytona 675. And in between riding these big bikes, I was returning to my YZF 125, and I can tell you from my perspective, every single time I got on a big bike, the first thing that I noticed was the weight difference. And it kind of put it into perspective, something that happened to me when I first bought my 125. So I first got my 125, and my neighbours across the road, I didn't know them at the time, but they had two bikes. And there's my 125 sat outside, and the neighbours came across and we started chatting about bikes. And the one of them, she asked me, do you mind if I sit on the bike? So I says, yeah, help yourself. So she sits on the 125 and she says, crikey, there's just no weight to it. She says it's so light. Well, of course, at the time I didn't have any frame of reference whatsoever. At that point I hadn't even done my CBT. I'd never ridden a motorbike in my life at that point, so I had no frame of reference. I didn't know whether my 125 was light or heavy or anything else. But now I know. Now I know what she was getting at. The moment I rode that CBR 600, I could tell the difference in weight. You know, the bike does feel more planted, you know, because it is more sturdy because you've got the extra weight. And it is a significant weight difference between a 125 and a big bike. And that's something that I'd say if you are looking at getting a big bike. In fact, to be honest, even if you're looking at getting your first bike, it doesn't matter. You really want to try, if you can, and sit on the bike that you're thinking of getting. I was fortunate with my YZF 125 that there was a person that I met at the BMAD show in Paynton back in 2017, and he had a YZF 125, and he let me sit on his YZF 125, and it made all the difference, because then at that point I knew that I fitted the bike. Whereas with this bike, I got this bike for a freaking steal, but because of that I bought it sight unseen on the internet, sent someone to pick it up for me. The first time I actually saw this bike was when it turned up at my house. So by the time I first sat on this bike, well, I'd already bought it. If the bike didn't fit me, it was too late. And to be honest, the bike doesn't fit me, or at least it doesn't fit me as well as my 125 does. So if you can, do sit on the bike that you're thinking of getting, particularly if you're moving from a 125 up to a big bike. If possible, sit on the bike first and just see if it fits you, because when I first saw one of these bikes I knew I loved them, and so when I had an opportunity to get one I knew I wanted it. But I didn't know that actually, in comparison to my 125 sports bike, my Daytona 675, the bars are lower, you're hunched over more, the pegs are higher. I'm just a little bit too squashed, and so now I'm having to try and fit the bike to me, which made me, I mean, I've adjusted a few things, but I may have to look at different rear sets, etc., just to get the bike to fit me. Now, if I had sat on this bike before buying it and realised that it didn't really fit me, would I still have bought it? Probably. I mean, look at it. Yes, I probably still would have bought this bike, but at least I would have known from the outset. So yeah, try not to make that mistake. Try and sit on the bike. If you get an opportunity, sit on the bike before you buy it. It feels like it was only yesterday we were parked up here on the YZF 125, eating lunch from the burger van down there, talking about big bikes that I was considering getting after I'd done my test. It was actually 14 months ago. Another thing I was told before getting my big bike, in fact I was told this by 4 different people. There was my first CBT instructor, who I went on to do my DAS with years later, 2 of my friends, and then my second CBT instructor. They all said the same thing. They all said that big bikes just make everything easier. And at the time, I didn't understand that, and I couldn't comprehend how that could be possible. I remember thinking, I've got all this extra power, and I'm going to have all this extra weight, so surely that's going to make things more difficult. How's it going to be easier? And then I'm on my DAS training and I start to see how bigger bikes make things easier. And the best example of this was the first time I joined a major road from a minor road. And you've got the slip road where you build up your speed and you join the road in amongst the other traffic that's already on the road. And historically on my 125, when I'm on that kind of slip road, I'm always having to decide which vehicle do I want to tuck in behind as I join that road. Only now you've got a big bike and you've got the extra power, and if you don't want to join the main road by tucking in behind another vehicle, then you've got the power to go in front of that vehicle. It's things like this that they were talking about. Bigger bikes do in some ways make everything else easier. You now have the power, so that if something goes wrong on the road and you need a quick instant burst of power, the power is there. And for me, this is where the extra power of a big bike really comes into its own. Yes, it makes certain aspects of riding easier, but also having that extra power means that if something goes wrong, you can get yourself out of the shit most of the time. Personally, I've found that riding a big bike in comparison to riding a 125, well, the two, you almost can't compare them because they are entirely different biking experiences. My 125 is relatively easy to ride. It's nice and light, but you're a little bit more vulnerable because you don't have the extra power. Whereas on the big bike here, you've got a hell of a lot more power to think about and a hell of a lot more weight. And that power, whilst it can get you out the shit, if you misuse it, it can just as easily get you in the shit. Big bikes just hit different, and there's a different level of confidence that comes with them. You know, that's not to say that I don't have confidence on my 125, because of course I do. But the 125 is a lot easier to ride. It's a lot lighter, but you'll spend most of your time rattling up and down through the gears. Whereas with a big bike, with the extra weight and the extra power, your concentration levels are just different. I wouldn't necessarily say greater or worse. I like to think that I concentrate at all times when I'm biking. It's just different, and that extra power, yes, it's fun. It is so much fun, and I'm not for 1 minute going to pretend that it isn't. Anyone who hasn't experienced a big bike, that's looking to progress from a 125 up to a big bike, and you're wondering, is it all that and a bag of chips? Yes, it absolutely is. That extra power is so much fun, but I would say use that extra power wisely, my friends. At the risk of sounding like Spider-Man, with extra power comes extra responsibility.